The human spirit rests on two pillars, our boundless endurance and our primal will to survive. But what happens when that will shatters the limits of morality and drags us into the abyss of madness? History is scarred with expeditions where men and women, starving and broken, cross the unthinkable line of cannibalism, not as monsters, but as desperate souls clinging to life. These are not just macabre tales, but chilling case studies of survival, where the thin veil of civilization was torn away to reveal humanity's darkest instincts. Stay with us as we uncover 10 of the most haunting survival stories ever recorded. At number 1, we uncover the chilling fate of the Franklin expedition, often described as the Arctic's most haunting mystery. In 1845, Sir John Franklin set out with two advanced ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, carrying 129 men determined to discover the fabled Northwest Passage. Their last sighting came in Lancaster Sound before they disappeared entirely into the icy void. What followed was not simply an expedition lost, but a descent into madness. Starvation and cannibalism. Trapped in Victoria Strait's relentless ice, the men endured nearly 2 years of isolation. By April 1848, Franklin and 23 others had already perished, leaving the rest to abandon their ships in a desperate march across King William Island. Inuit oral testimony spoke of ghastly scenes, skeletal remains bearing knife marks and human flesh roasted for food. Evidence later confirmed by 20th century forensic studies. Anthropologists uncovered broken bones, split for marrow, and cut marks consistent with end-stage cannibalism, painting a grim portrait of survival at any cost. To make matters worse, elevated lead poisoning from poorly soldered tins likely triggered confusion, paranoia, and irrational choices, such as abandoning ample supplies while hauling luxury items like curtain rods and furniture. The expedition became a terrifying lesson in how human endurance collapses under cold, hunger, and poisoned minds. Once dismissed, the Inuit accounts now stand as tragically accurate records of one of history's most catastrophic Arctic journeys, where ambition froze into horror and survival degenerated into cannibalistic despair. Sliding into number 2, we confront one of America's darkest migration tragedies, the Donner Party, whose westward dream in 1846 turned into a nightmare of starvation and death. Leaving Missouri in high hopes, the pioneers followed the ill-advised Hastings Cutoff, a so-called shortcut that delayed them disastrously in the Utah desert. By October, an early blizzard imprisoned their wagons in the Sierra Nevada, with no food, no livestock, and no escape. Their makeshift cabins around Donner Lake soon became tombs of desperation. Diaries from Patrick Breen describe starving families boiling hides, eating stray animals, and slowly watching their humanity erode. The infamous Forlorn Hope rescue attempt saw snowbound survivors resorting to consuming the bodies of companions. But even more chilling was William Foster's cold-blooded murder of 2 Miwok guides, whose flesh was then eaten, evidence of the moral collapse that set in when starvation ruled. By the time rescuers reached them in 1847, horror greeted them. Half-eaten corpses, severed limbs, and survivors too weak to speak. Of 87 pioneers, only 48 survived, many scarred for life. Figures like Louis Keseberg, discovered among butchered remains, were forever branded as cannibals despite legal acquittals. The Donner Party's tragedy became a grim warning, not only against reckless shortcuts, but also against the fragility of morality under extreme hunger. It endures as a symbol of how pioneers chasing opportunity faced unimaginable desperation, where human beings crossed boundaries once thought impossible. At number 3, the tale of the whale ship Essex reveals a maritime nightmare so harrowing it inspired Herman Melville's Moby Dick. In 1820, the vessel was struck and sunk by a furious sperm whale deep in the Pacific, leaving 20 men stranded thousands of miles from land. Survival seemed possible when Captain George Pollard Jr. suggested heading west to the Marquesas Islands, just 1,200 miles away, yet fear overcame reason. The crew, terrified of rumored cannibals on those islands, insisted instead on an impossible 4,000-mile voyage east to South America. This fateful choice sealed their doom, as starvation and thirst consumed them. Ironically, the men soon became the very cannibals they feared. Bodies of dead sailors were eaten for survival, while desperation reached its most grotesque moment aboard Pollard's boat. Following the custom of the sea, 4 men drew lots to determine who would die to feed the others. The victim was Pollard's teenage cousin, Owen Coffin. who accepted his fate with chilling calm before being shot by a crewmate. By the time rescue arrived, survivors were discovered gnawing on bones, reluctant to surrender the grisly remains of their companions. The Essex tragedy exposes the cruel irony of fear. By avoiding imagined danger, the sailors walked into a reality of cannibalism and psychological collapse. It remains one of the sea's most haunting episodes, a brutal testament to how desperation strips away humanity on the open ocean. At number 4, we step into the snowbound nightmare of Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571, a survival story that shook the world in 1972. When a chartered plane carrying a Uruguayan rugby team, their friends and family crashed into the desolate Andes Mountains, only 29 of the 45 passengers survived the initial impact and avalanches that followed. What awaited the 16 eventual survivors was not just brutal cold and hunger, but the slow realization that no rescue was coming, confirmed by a crackling radio broadcast announcing that search efforts had been abandoned. Trapped for 72 days at high altitude, with no wildlife, no vegetation, and no supplies, the group faced an agonizing moral choice: starve to death or consume the bodies of their dead companions. After much prayer, reflection, and debate, they made a collective decision, describing it not as cannibalism, but as an act of brotherhood, accepting that those who had perished had given their bodies so others might live. Survivor Carlos Paez explained, "I would have felt honored if they had used me to live," transforming the horror into a pact of solidarity. Unlike other infamous episodes of survival cannibalism, this ordeal did not collapse into savagery. Instead, it highlighted extraordinary discipline, compassion, and unity. The climax came when Nando Parado and Roberto Canessa undertook a death-defying 10-day trek across glaciers with nothing but a makeshift sleeping bag. Ultimately finding help and saving their friends, the Andes survivors became living proof of human resilience, reminding the world that in the face of the impossible, survival is not just about flesh and blood, it's about the will to honor life itself. At number 5, we revisit the harrowing tale of the yacht Mignonette, a tragedy that forever altered maritime law. In 1884, this small vessel, sailing from England to Australia, was struck by a massive wave in the South Atlantic, leaving its 4-man crew stranded on a fragile lifeboat with only 2 tins of turnips and a single turtle. As days dragged into weeks, starvation hollowed them out. By July 20th, the youngest aboard, 17-year-old Richard Parker, collapsed after drinking seawater, drifting into a coma. With no rescue in sight, Captain Tom Dudley and mate Edwin Stevens made a dreadful decision. They killed Parker with a penknife, consuming his flesh alongside sailor Ned Brooks, who abstained from the killing but partook in the eating. 4 days later, salvation arrived, but so did scandal. On their return to England, Dudley and Stevens were charged with murder in a landmark case, R.V. Dudley and Stevens. For centuries, sailors had accepted the custom of the sea, where drawing lots or sacrificing the weakest justified survival cannibalism. But the court rejected this defense, declaring that necessity cannot excuse the taking of innocent life. Though sentenced to death, their punishment was commuted to 6 months, reflecting public sympathy. Yet the case established a precedent that survives in law to this day, enshrining the principle that human life cannot be weighed against survival calculations. The wreck of the Mignonette is more than a grisly story. It is a defining moment when law, morality, and desperation collided on the high seas. At number 6, we encounter the wreck of the Méduse, a catastrophe that became both a human scandal and an immortal work of art. In 1816, the French frigate was en route to Senegal, under the command of a politically appointed captain with little nautical skill. Incompetence quickly sealed their fate, grounding the vessel on a sandbank off the West African coast. While officers and elites secured seats in lifeboats, more than 150 ordinary sailors and passengers were forced onto a massive, hastily built raft. What followed was one of history's most infamous descents into chaos. Abandoned by the lifeboats that severed the tow line, the raft drifted helplessly. Overcrowding, thirst, and madness drove mutinies, with frenzied violence breaking out nightly. Survivors later recalled how murder, delirium, and cannibalism intertwined until the strong dominated the weak. After 13 agonizing days, the ship Argus stumbled upon the raft by chance. Of the 150 souls abandoned, only 15 remained alive, and many of them would die soon after. The Méduse tragedy did not fade quietly. It ignited a scandal in France, exposing corruption, incompetence, and class prejudice in the Navy. Its horrors were seared into history by Theodore Géricault's monumental painting, The Raft of the Medusa, which captured the desperation of men, signaling desperately to a tiny ship on the horizon. This iconic work turned the disaster into a timeless political statement, condemning not just poor seamanship, but the deeper madness of a society that valued rank and privilege over human life. At number 7, we turn to Jamestown, the first permanent English settlement in North America, where desperation reached terrifying extremes during the winter of 1609 to 1610. Known to history as the Starving Time, this ordeal saw nearly 300 settlers trapped inside their fort, cut off from supplies by the Powhatan Confederacy and ravaged by hunger. By spring, only 60 skeletal survivors remained. For centuries, rumors swirled that the colonists had resorted to cannibalism, with early reports even describing a man who murdered and ate his wife. Long dismissed as grim folklore, those suspicions were validated in 2012 when archaeologists unearthed the butchered remains of a 14-year-old girl, nicknamed Jane. Her skull and shin bore unmistakable cut marks, analyzed by forensic expert Dr. Douglas Owsley of the Smithsonian. His findings revealed deliberate attempts to remove flesh and access the brain, confirming survival cannibalism. The discovery of Jane's remains, alongside bones of horses and dogs, provided the first forensic proof of cannibalism at Jamestown, turning rumor into undeniable fact. This moment transformed Jamestown's history from one of mere colonial struggle to a chilling American horror story, showing how close the settlement came to total collapse. Jane's story personalized the suffering, putting a human face on what was once only whispered legend. It underscores how fragile the line between civilization and desperation truly is, and how starvation can strip away every veneer of morality, even in the very foundation of what became the United States. At number 8, we step back nearly 2 millennia to uncover one of the earliest recorded acts of survival cannibalism, the Usipetes Mutiny. As chronicled by the Roman historian Tacitus in the 1st century CE, the Usipetes, a Germanic tribe conscripted into Roman service, seized their ships in revolt, setting out on the sea in search of freedom. But liberation quickly devolved into a nightmare. With provisions exhausted and their ships adrift, starvation forced them into the same grim choices that later haunted sailors and explorers centuries later. Tacitus recounts how the desperate tribe drew lots to select victims, sacrificing some so that others might endure. This macabre lottery, eerily similar to the custom of the sea, later practiced during the tragedies of the Essex and the Mignonette, highlights the disturbing universality of human responses to starvation. The Usipetes Mutiny is more than a footnote in Roman history. It is proof that the psychological breaking point under extreme duress transcends cultures and ages. Whether on ancient warships or 19th century lifeboats, human beings facing slow death often turn to the same cold calculation: survival at the expense of their own. This precedent reminds us that cannibalism and desperation is not a modern horror, but a timeless one, a grim constant in the human condition whenever food and hope run out at sea. At number 9, we confront the chilling saga of the Francis Mary, a timber cargo ship wrecked in the North Atlantic in 1826. After a gale crippled the vessel, the floating wreck became a coffin for its crew and passengers, who clung to life for 32 days amidst cold, starvation, and despair. Ultimately, only 6 survived, but their endurance came at a horrifying cost. Their salvation was secured by consuming the bodies of those who had died. What set this tragedy apart was the presence of Anne Saunders, a passenger whose role was central to survival. Reports in English newspapers describe Saunders as the one who carried out the gruesome task of cutting and preparing corpses for consumption. Armed with 2 knives, she approached the act with a cold practicality that both horrified and fascinated the public. Unlike other survival tales that were cloaked in shame or denial, the Francis Mary became a media sensation, partly because Saunders' calm fortitude stood in such stark contrast to the madness usually associated with cannibalism. Her actions made her infamous, turning her into a reluctant symbol of survival at any cost. When the survivors were finally rescued by HMS Blonde, the story was reported with lurid fascination. The Francis Mary case illustrates how 19th century society consumed these tragedies, sometimes condemning, sometimes sensationalizing, but always captivated by the dark extremes of human willpower when survival demanded the unthinkable. Finally, at number 10, we end with the infamous story of Alfred Packer, forever branded the Colorado Cannibal. In the brutal winter of 1874, Packer and 5 companions set out into the San Juan Mountains of Colorado Territory. Only Packer emerged alive, and with him came a tale drenched in blood and suspicion. He claimed that his companions had died from starvation and exposure, and that cannibalism had been their last resort. Yet evidence quickly unraveled his account. Investigators discovered that Packer had been found in possession of his companions' belongings and money, and the site of their camp revealed signs of foul play inconsistent with his story. Charged with murder, he insisted on his innocence, portraying himself as another victim of circumstance. But the jury saw through his claims, convicting him of manslaughter and forever etching his name into the annals of American frontier horror. Unlike collective tragedies, such as the Donner Party or the Franklin Expedition, Packer's case raised disturbing psychological questions. Was this a story of survival gone wrong, or a premeditated act of greed disguised as necessity? His legacy became a mixture of folklore and infamy, immortalized in ballads, jokes, and court records. More than a century later, the Alfred Packer case remains a macabre reminder that the line between survival and murder is perilously thin, and that madness on the frontier was not always born of desperation. It could also be born of opportunity. These stories remind us that survival is not just about strength, but about how thin the line is between civilization and our most primal instincts. From the mutiny of the Usapetes to the tragedy of the Donner Party and the haunting discovery of Jane at Jamestown, each tale forces us to confront the darkest corners of human endurance. They are not simply horrors of the past, but mirrors reflecting what desperation can make of us. Thank you for watching. If you found this journey into history as chilling as we did, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more untold stories of the human spirit.